The story you are about to hear is true.
Attention, all true.
She's alive! Alive!
Welcome to the Retroist.
The middle to late 1980s were an interesting time for me watching television. I found it to be more polished than TV that had been going on in the earlier part of the 80s, and certainly very different from what was going on in the 70s. One thing that changed for me dramatically is the presence of cable TV in my family's house had grown. We had it on one television, very happy about that, in our living room. It was this amazing treat. But then at one point, one of my older sisters decided she was working and that she would like to have cable television as well, and that she would pay for it. So she had cable TV installed in her room, which was the next room over to me. Naturally, when she wasn't there, I constantly would go in there and watch TV in her room to have some privacy. Unfortunately, I would bring food into her room, and by mistake, I might have spilled some soda on her carpet, and she was not very happy with that. Things changed though. One day, I'm walking home from school, and I walk past a house that had put a whole bunch of junk on the curb, and I am not a person who can resist a giant pile of junk, so I started looking through it, and somebody threw out a cable box, and I thought, wow, what a find. I grabbed it, ran home with it, and I hooked it up to our TV set just to see if it worked, and it did. That's when I got an idea. What if I could split the cable in my sister's room, run it into my room, and get cable television? I went to the one place I needed to go to find the right piece of equipment I need, which was Radio Shack. I got a splitter, I got some cable, ran home, and realized I didn't buy enough cable. So then I did something that really annoyed my family, my sister in particular. I drilled a hole right through the walls between our rooms and ran the cable that way. Now, I didn't think about the size of the cable, so I used a pretty large drill bit, and the hole was about the size of a golf ball. The cable fit perfectly, and when I hooked it up, everything worked fine. But my sister noticed, because now the sounds between our rooms carried really well, especially TV sounds. I don't think I noticed as much as she did, but over time we started shoving things around the cable to quiet things so that there was no interaction between our rooms. I'm sure MacGyver would have done a better job. Oh yeah, the subject of today's show is MacGyver. MacGyver would have taken a straw and some sort of powder and then slowly worked it through the wall, and you would hardly even notice that the cable went through the wall. That's not how I do things. I'd be a poor MacGyver. I'm just all brute force. If we didn't have a drill and all we had was a hammer, I just would have hammered a hole through that wall to get cable television. I probably would have blown up the wall just to get cable television in my own room. After I got TV in my room, I never left my room. That thing was on when I was home 24/7. One of the shows I would enjoy during that period was MacGyver, a show I didn't even need cable to have, but it's a fun show, and like a lot of young people, I dreamed that one day I could have the skills that MacGyver has. Unfortunately, I'm not MacGyver, but I can be a big fan of the show, and I'd like to talk to you about MacGyver today. We'll talk about the people in front of and behind the camera. We'll talk about production. We'll talk about some of the plots, the 2016 reboot, and of course we'll throw in a few surprises here and there. We have an info-packed episode ahead of us, so without further ado, let's start the show. MacGyver is an action-adventure, sometimes I think science fiction, television series. It was created by Lee David Zlotoff and was produced by Henry Winkler and John Rich. Winkler, you might remember, played the Fonz on Happy Days. He also makes just one cameo in the season 6 episode of MacGyver, playing a lawyer, something he would go on to play later on TV's Arrested Development. The show would run for 7 seasons, was on the ABC network. The show happened because there was an intersection of those 3 people just at the right time. Winkler had just finished his over a decade run on Happy Days. Rich had been on a sitcom called Mr. Sunshine, canceled on ABC, and Lee David Zlotoff was working as a producer on the TV show Remington Steele. So they started talking about this show about a person who uses their brains over brawn and comes up with solutions, and they sold the idea to Paramount, and that's when ABC became interested in the series. If you watch the show, you'll note that the first 2 seasons and the final season look different than seasons 3 through 6. That's because there were different filming locations. In seasons 1, 2, and 7, the show was filmed in Los Angeles, and then in those middle seasons, they moved to Vancouver, Canada. And that's because the show was almost canceled due to its high production costs, because there's a lot going on, and it's, I guess, cheaper to film in Canada. Some of the main changes you'll notice if you watch the show, especially right in a row, is that there's a lot more locations when they move to Vancouver, kind of change locales all the time in that area. But also MacGyver finally kind of moves into the place where a lot of people associate him living, which is a houseboat. And that houseboat was docked in a Vancouver boatyard. And when the show was over, they sold it. In 2014, the houseboat was sold for under $40,000 on Craigslist. So there's somebody who owns MacGyver's houseboat and got it for a steal, especially since its valuation was in the $200,000 range. I can't imagine that it was in great shape, though, and I'm sure someone's going to have to put a lot of money into fixing it up. Hopefully they got some MacGyver skills. One of the most important aspects of MacGyver is its star, Richard Dean Anderson. Comes across as a smart, kind of aw-shucksy boy next door, but when people were looking for an action star, that's not at all who came to audition. This was the 80s, of course, and, there's a lot of tough-talking, commando style, Schwarzenegger, Stallone, people who came out for this role. When Anderson came in for the role, he actually used reading glasses and put them on, and Winkler thought that was a very humanizing thing, that it captured something about the character that nobody else had brought, and they thought this guy's going to be a breakout star right away. And Dean was up for the task. When I say he's up for the task, Anderson did a lot of his own stunts in the series. This, of course, becomes problematic as you accumulate damage to your body. So in later seasons, you start to note that there are stunt doubles doing a lot of the work for him. But it's pretty impressive that he would put himself on the line. And you could see that during earlier seasons that, wow, that's actually Richard Dean Anderson doing these things. One of the defining things about MacGyver, and something that makes him kind of a departure from action characters in any decade, is his disdain for guns. Instead, he's just armed with, most of the time, a Swiss Army knife and, of course, his brain. And this leads him to come up with all sorts of what are called MacGyverisms, solutions to problems. There are guns littered about whenever MacGyver's doing anything, and I am sometimes just wanting to scream for him to pick up the gun. This would be over in 5 seconds. But no, MacGyver is MacGyver, and he has to come up with a solution that's often non-lethal, that gives people the benefit of the doubt. And once you start to accept that, and it probably takes 2 seasons if you're watching the show from beginning to end, you start to realize there's just no way. He's never going to pick up that gun. He does pick up a gun in, I think, the pilot episode, but gives it to somebody else. But that's the pilot before everything gets locked down. In later seasons, he actually picks up a gun and then, of course, uses it as a wrench as opposed to using it as a gun. MacGyver likes a challenge. Talking about that pilot, there's an interview with executive producer John Rich where he said that the original pilot was over 90 minutes long and not very good. And so they came in and over a holiday recut the episode, brought it down to 60 minutes. And the original director of the pilot was so unhappy with these changes that he changed his name to the Hollywood generic pseudonym of Alan Smithy. So you can see that in the credits when you watch it. But it is Gerald Friedman who directed it. So MacGyver worked for 2 organizations. I guess he worked for some other organizations because, he's in the Challengers Club, which is a boys and girls club. But the 2 he worked and did his missions for were the DXS, which is very hard for me to say multiple times. I will have, I'm sure, edited some of this, but I just tried to say DXS several times fast, and it came out very odd. The DXS is the Department of External Services, which is a U.S. intelligence agency where MacGyver and his buddy, Peter Thornton, are working during the first season of the show. show. MacGyver was recruited by Pete. We find that out in season 2. In future seasons, they would work for something called the Phoenix Foundation, which is a non-profit think tank and government contractor. It's this agency that just does about everything. They're really pro-environment, really pro-whatever MacGyver's into. And at the same time, their work at the DXS still kind of comes up, especially Pete's connection to it, so they don't abandon it. This is especially important when it comes to one of, I'd say, the main villain of MacGyver, Murdoch, who works for the Homicide International Trust, or HIT, which is almost G.I. Joe-like in its amazingness. So there's this recurring character, Murdoch, and the characters of HIT, and we learn a little bit about their organization, and it's really campy and cartoony and really endearing. Makes me so happy when there's anything that involves Murdoch and HIT. Looking at even the Phoenix Foundation, I'm often curious. It's such a large organization that does so much and seemingly has an unlimited budget. It's kind of a dream job for anybody who wants to work in anything because you're kind of doing good, I guess, for the world, and yet you get to go on adventures. And MacGyver seems to get paid a tremendous amount of money to do things because sometimes he'll take his money instead of taking it. He'll give it to the person who was either victimized or the main thrust of that episode. And those people are always overjoyed because it allows them to buy a whole new life. So I think he's getting paid $100,000, $200,000 per mission in the 80s. I think that's pretty good money. After these messages, we'll be right back.
Well, MacGyver is a kind of troubleshooter.
Duct tape?
Never leave home without it. He likes to make clever little things out of odd bits. It's a little recipe I use in emergencies. Not perfect.
Who are you?
He's MacGyver on USA. Weeknights at 7, 6 Central.
Air freshener, $1.29 on debit MasterCard. Tube sock, $4. Paperclip, ballpoint pen, rubber band, tweezers, nasal spray, and a turkey baster, $14. The little things that get you through the day, priceless. There are some things money can't buy. For everyday stuff, there's debit MasterCard.
And now, back to the show. Now let's talk a little bit about the cast of MacGyver. It's pretty simple. There's 2 main characters and then quite a few recurring characters. But the most important character is Richard Dean Anderson playing Angus MacGyver. That's right. His first name is Angus, which we don't find out for multiple seasons. Once I knew his name was Angus after watching it originally, and I've been doing a rewatch, I keep waiting for them to drop it again, thinking, oh, this would be a good time. But nobody even seems to question. It's kind of weird. If I knew someone who was constantly going by kind of one name, I would have to ask them, especially if I knew them a lot. I would constantly ask, what's their full name? It's just me. So MacGyver is a secret agent of the Phoenix Foundation, where it's not so secret, goes about trying to do good, carrying a Swiss Army knife, some duct tape, and the most important weapon of all, his mind. Huh? Not bad. We do know that MacGyver had some family issues. Parents got killed in traumatic ways. Kind of haunts him. He doesn't allow a lot of people to get close to him. From what I understand, that might have been because whenever they brought in a female character to get close to MacGyver, they would get a lot of letters from fans who did not want MacGyver to wind up with anybody because they liked the idea of MacGyver being available, I guess. Or maybe the idea that he could just romance more people. It's during the 7th season that we find out his first name. According to Richard Dean Anderson, he suggested the name because he just saw it on a sign in Vancouver while he was living up there and just thought, that sounds good. Angus MacGyver. It's a good name. Although if they were calling him Angus the whole time, I don't know if I would have liked that. MacGyver's better. Before the show's premiere, though, there was actually a second name for the character that they would never use. There were these flyers that were circulated by Paramount, and they credited Anderson as playing Stacy MacGyver. And this is probably because it was taken from an early version of the script. When they were trying to come up with the name of the character, Zlotoff said that he wanted something that sounded really masculine. And they were going to call this character just Guy, which is a bit on the nose. So they decided that they would add just something to the word Guy, and they added Mac Guy. And then, yeah, that's okay. And then they went with MacGyver. Richard Dean Anderson was born in 1950. He's an American actor, producer. He started his television career as Dr. Jeff Weber in the soap opera series General Hospital and worked there till 1981. If you heard my Facts of Life podcast, you'll know that I talk about his participation on that show and an attempt at a spin-off. He's probably best known